My Family Thinks I'm Crazy, a podcast where I, your host, try to give you some tips on how you can explain all this weird, wild, crazy conspiracy stuff to the people you love most. Because that's what I've been trying to do for the past 10 years with no success.
I've been telling everybody that our government is shady, but every time I do, my family thinks I'm crazy.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast double feature. That's right, bringing to you two appearances that I have made on various podcasts. First up, the Hidden Gateway podcast with my new friend Jesston Williams, and then after that, stick around for an interview with myself on Forbidden Knowledge News, hosted by Chris Mathieu. It was a great time on both separate occasions. The interview with Jesston happened, I think, in December, the last week of December, first week of January, and then the Chris Mathieu interview on Forbidden Knowledge News happened the first week of January. So here we are in 2022, the first double feature of the year. Enjoy. Be sure to subscribe to Forbidden Knowledge News and Hidden Gateway on the same app that you use to listen to this show. That's right. Tell them My Family Thinks I'm Crazy sent you. And be sure to sign up on the Patreon to support the show. That's right. Patreon is the best place. You can also send us a one-time PayPal donation. That is always appreciated. And that's a good way to get a spirit animal name as well. You can also send me a message via the Telegram. That's right, we don't use the pod inbox anymore, but we are taking voice messages via Telegram. So join the Telegram family and leave us a message. Tell us why your family thinks you're crazy. Keep it short, keep it sweet, get to the point. Make sure you tell us where you're from, and maybe you'll hear yourself on the show. Sounds cool, right? So, and also, we got Rockfin. That's right, Rockfin. My Family Thinks I'm Crazy on Rockfin, where we go live, and we also have some bonus video content that is only available there and on the Patreon. So whichever one you prefer, show us some love wherever it suits you best. It's the only way we keep this show on the road, folks. That's right. So thank you so much for listening, and enjoy this double feature. First up, Hidden Gateway podcast with Jesston Williams.
I want to welcome you to another episode of the Hidden Gateway podcast. As always, I am your host, Jesston Williams. Today's guest is Mark Palmer-Steeves. Now, Mark is the host of the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast, where he and his guests cover a wide array of topics such as bizarre events, conspiracies, the paranormal, ancient knowledge, spirituality, and many more topics. Mark, what's up, man? Welcome to the Hidden Gateway podcast. How you doing?
I'm doing great. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. And yeah, all those things are pretty true. I think there's a couple of those on the list that I haven't quite covered yet, but that is the goal, is to kind of have a nice variety of topics on the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast, because there's a variety of reasons why my family thinks I'm crazy. It's not just one theory or another.
So it's true, your family really thinks you're crazy, is that right?
Yeah, it's a sadly true. I mean, it feels a little. Maybe if you asked me in like February, I wouldn't have such a soft-spoken answer. But given that we just came out of the holiday season, it's a little more on my mind. How crazy they think I am. But yeah, I think the proof's in the pudding. So once I show them that what I'm doing is actually working out, and it's not as much of like a pipe dream as they might think, then who knows? Maybe they'll think I'm crazy less, but yeah, they don't really have a lot of faith in a lot of the things I say.
You know what, Mark, that resonates with me very much so, because my family thinks I'm crazy as well. They thought I was a pretty normal guy up until probably about a year ago. I went through this transformation, if you will. I've been on this hardcore spiritual journey, man, and some of my experiences that they became aware of have them kind of scratching their head like, who is this guy? It's almost as if they don't know me anymore, but I'm cool with it. I have to do me, right? I have to live my life. But man, enough about me, man. Let's talk about you, your show, man. Man, like I told you before we hit record, man, it's just a freaking phenomenal show. Excellent host. You have had some great guests on your show, and you're doing damn well, man, and well deserved, man. Tell me about some of the stats. I don't remember them offhand, but I want people to know about your website and your podcast, man. I want them to check it out, because I'm sure our listeners would love it as well. So how long have you been doing it, and tell me about some of your stats.
Sure, I'm honored to tell you, because it is kind of cool. I mean, I never thought this many people would listen to my show. It certainly helps the fact that I've been on Sam's show, and I helped Sam with his show, Tinfoil Hat, which is immensely more popular than my show is, for sure. But I mean, we just hit 200,000 downloads, and we've been going for about a year now. So I'm pretty stoked. I mean, we got a good average, and this is a good spot to be for a podcast that just started, less than 2 years ago. So I'm pretty stoked about that. But I also started a cooperative, which I'd love to have you a part of, for podcasters, called Alt Media United. And the goal is to work together to remain independent, because I don't think that we necessarily need to be part of like a whole network or, recreate any of that. I don't know if that really is even beneficial to anybody going into a network. But if we can remain united as independent content creators, my belief is that will allow us to at least stay on the cutting edge of certain technologies and stay in the loop with one another, to not, segregate our audiences so much. Because I feel like what happens with these new platforms is like somebody gets behind Odyssey or somebody gets behind Rockfin, and then like the people who are left out of that, maybe they don't feel like they're doing the same thing as everyone else. So the idea with the cooperative is to sort of show everybody the road to how to do this podcasting thing the right way. I just started, so it's all kind of like a learning process for me. So as much as I'm learning, I like to be as transparent with people as possible. That's why I kind of like perked up when you're like, hey, tell me about your stats, because no one's ever asked me that on a show, and I'm pretty proud of it. But I think this is cool for people to realize, like, if you work hard at something and you put it out with good intention and honesty, it can reach this many people. And that's not even really a lot. What's really cool to me, as a matter of fact, is just how many countries we've reached, because there's little pockets around the world of people who, like, in the hundreds listen to the show. And again, this could be like one or two people listening to every episode, because they really just tell me download numbers. They don't tell me like how many actual people are listening. But like almost 400 in Sweden, got 200 downloads in South Africa, we got 150 in Brazil, like close to 4,000 in Australia. Thailand's got like close to 300. So countries that I didn't really think were into podcasting, there's a lot of people listening to the show there. So that's cool to see. I think Germany's our biggest non-English speaking country. But yeah, the fact that the show's going that far is awesome. I'm psyched, and I'm sure people have that same feeling around the world, that their family thinks they're crazy. I think it resonates.
I think it does, man. There's a special group of our type, and I think our type is going more and more by the day, by the week, by the month, man. It's been this shift. of, I guess I would say, consciousness, if you will, over the last, I don't know, year and a half, 2 years, whatever it may be. And
Absolutely.
isn't it something like you talked about with your podcast being genuine and being true? Isn't it something else how you put that type of energy into it, and the return of investment is phenomenal? Like you said, would you have imagined 2 years ago if someone told you that you would be doing a podcast and it would be as successful as it is so soon? What would you have thought?
I'll tell you what, I did do a podcast 2 years ago, and it wasn't. I had a show called The Bud Triangle that I did with my friends, and this is in a different time period. Like, COVID did a lot of good things for podcasting, unfortunately. And one of the things that it did was it normalized what we're doing right now, the Zoom meeting. And, I could have figured that out if I had enough compunction to research it, but I didn't for whatever reason. So I had it stuck in my head that I needed to have a studio space and mics and have friends there. So it was really there was a lot of things that were holding me back, that was slowing down the actual process itself, that I thought were vital to the process, that actually weren't. So once I, unfortunately let go of those friends that I had on the show, I noticed not only does the show sound better, but I have more time. A lot of things improve when I let some of those things go. And that's not to talk bad about those guys. They're still my friends somewhat. I don't know, it was mutual, we'll just say. But yeah, it is interesting, because I was doing that Bud Triangle show on YouTube. I had no idea how to do a podcast, and it was reaching 10, 15 people per episode. So yeah, luckily I met Sam, and that was really, for me, a big deal, because I had listened to his show a bunch for years. Every episode I've listened to, and especially at that point in my life, I was listening to his show and the Higher Side Chats and Grimerica's show a lot, and it was motivating me to get in touch with this world. Like you said, a bunch of people that we're resonating with, I'm finding are resonating with my show, reaching out to me. Now I'm making new friends like yourself who also have podcasts, and it's totally a 180 from the world I was living in when I met Sam, because I had a somewhat of a podcast, but it wasn't my intention to get on his show. I just wanted to give him this book, because I was like, you know what? If he reads this book, maybe it'll bring some more of this element to the show that I like listening to, right? Okay. So I give him a book called The Kybalion, for those who don't understand the East Coast accent here. The Kybalion is a very interesting book. It's the 7 Hermetic laws. And I was just another random dude that came to one of Sam's shows and met him afterwards, shook his hand, and I was like, hey, take this book. And he's like, oh, give it to me at the Creek in the Cave. So I go to the Creek in the Cave, this other comedy club, and he's hanging out with everybody. And I ended up, leaving a good impression on him, because he asked me to be on his show a couple months later on one of his sort of Patreon shows. And just talking to Sam over and over again, I was really nervous, and my voice I found my voice, because I'd always been interested in this kind of stuff, but it's one thing to tell your coworker, it's another thing to tell the podcaster that you idolize, So I'm like, oh God, what should I talk about? So I talk about Skull and Bones, because that's such it's close to home for me, literally. New Haven, Connecticut is home of Yale University, and I've had small experiences / interactions with Skull and Bones and the school itself, and not directly with anybody initiated or anything like that, but from seeing, driving by at a weird moment and seeing somebody walk in the building, to actually being a delivery guy and getting inside the university and seeing some of the weird buildings. Those are the experiences that I had before I even found Tinfoil Hat, or around that time. And so, yeah, I'm sure I'm going all over the place here, but let me try to,
good, man.
Thank you. Let me try to rein it in a little bit. But my point being is, I was super nervous, super wow, what are we going to talk about? And it ended up going really well. And Sam had me back on his show a bunch of times, and that led to me creating this show that is doing really well. But I can't ever bring that up without mentioning Sam, because it's I owe him a huge bit of thank you and gratitude for, kind of elevating me from my position as just another random fringe conspiracy thinker out there to somebody who actually had a chance to, I don't want to say inspire people, but I've been able to put the right people in position to talk to Sam to then inspire hundreds of thousands of people. I mean, literally, the show I did with him on Tinfoil was like, 100,000 views on YouTube. I'm sure more on the audio side of things. And I was just, talking about Aleister Crowley, and all of these things that I had thought about while I was a delivery guy, just like, I wish people knew about this, just like really frustrated at the world. It's so weird. In a synchronistic way, the universe gave me an opportunity to share these ideas on a big platform in this kind of behind the scenes way, where I'm not the one telling Sam what to believe or what to do. I'm just putting the right people in the position to have that conversation with him, and he does it really well, and that's all of that has inspired me to do what I do, and luckily Sam pays me to book for his show, which gives me a little bit of freedom to go full time with this podcast. It's definitely not easy. I'm not making full time money, but I'm doing full time hours, and I think that's the kind of dedication that's going to pay off. So I'm super grateful. And yes, it is like a little bit of a shock to see how many people are listening to the show, even considering all the help I've gotten,
Excellent, man. Well said. And you're going to continue to do some great things, man. Input equals output, and you have your mind right, it sounds, brother. And good stuff. Now, one thing I want to ask you about is that book that you gave Sam, where it talked about the 7 Hermetic laws. Now, I'm not familiar with that. I've heard of that term, but I want you, if you could, to take a few minutes to tell me about that.
Sure. Let me just lean back and grab the book real quick.
Yeah, go for it.
So I have, my books are not alphabetically organized at all, but I have them somewhat committed to memory and where they are. So I found it. This is a book for people. Sorry about, is this audio or video only? I don't want to waste.
It's audio.
Cool. All right. So I'll just show you. But yeah, the 7 Hermetic laws, just to give people a quick breakdown, if you haven't heard them before. It goes, the first principle is mentalism, then they go into vibration, polarity, rhythm, causation, gender, correspondence. There's a lot of overarching ideas. And I think it was just talked about on Tinfoil Hat, as a matter of fact. Ross Ben, someone who I'm a huge fan of, was just on Tinfoil Hat, and he kind of broke down the 7 Hermetic laws, and the way he described them was really interesting. It's like the infrastructure of the Matrix, like the rules of the Matrix, and once you understand these rules of how the Matrix operates, you're able to move more freely within the Matrix. So that's part of why I gave Sam that book, even though that episode was recorded only a couple of weeks ago. It's funny how that kind of thing synchronistically happens. Like an idea that was in my head sort of gets channeled into, booking a certain person, and then that idea comes through on the podcast, really without me, telling Ross to bring that up at all. It's just really cool how that happened. But I encourage people to go and listen to that if they want to hear some super interesting stuff, as well as a little bit of a breakdown on the Kabbalion. But that aside, it's philosophy. It's a Hermetic philosophy. And one of these things that I learned from a young age was that the truth is actively being hidden. Why? Well, I don't really have the answer to that. I have a couple of, theories that I've battled with, but the truth is being hidden. And it seems like if we want to look at things glass half full, it's almost like a challenge for those who are worthy. And I like challenges. I was a wrestler, martial artist. I got my ass kicked a bunch, by no means like a professional, but I enjoyed the competition. I enjoyed the challenge. And after a skateboarding accident that left me with a broken wrist, I kind of stepped a little bit away from martial arts, and that drive that I had developed through those sort of combat arts stuck with me while I was digging through this information, and really it comes from a place of wanting to help the world, you know, and we can get into the sentimentals and all that if you want. And like, I'll start crying, but the truth is I care about the world in a really deep and profound way. It used to be, you know, environment and nature and animals, but now if I talk about that, people think I'm some kind of climate change hippie, you know, and that's not really accepted in the conspiracy community on a superficial level. On a deep level, I think everybody agrees with the underlying sentiment, but unfortunately this whole climate change nonsense has sort of mixed its way into the, what I would say is like Gaia warrior movement, the people who are connected with the Earth Mother and want to reestablish, you know, the connection with her, or connection with the natural biosphere. That always drove me, because as a kid I was fascinated by animals. I would read these animal books and like classify them all and try to figure out like, oh, what each animal did, and really interested in like seeing the full picture and how they all fit together. And you understand when you study nature and biomes that there's a symbiosis that occurs, a balancing force within each environment, right? And that sort of underlying philosophy got transferred somehow into my, you know, just wanting to understand the world. And like, I just saw this really incomplete picture from school and college, and I'm like, there's got to be more than this. And obviously 2012 being not so obvious to you guys, the year I graduated high school, but for everybody, I mean, I'm sure you guys remember 2012 was like the big apocalypse, and it was also like the big awakening, you know. So this is the year I'm graduating and going into the world, like, you know. So for me, I was like, you know, a lot of really cool information, spirit science, Ralph Smart, Alan Watts, like all of these like interesting, like somewhat esoteric but more positivity type crystals and things like that too, you know. And I got this sort of hippie vibe, you know, this hippie vibe blossom, but underlying that was a very anti-establishment, lone, you know, wolf type figure in my mind. And the reason I brought up the biome and the symbiosis is because when you see this incomplete picture that they give us in school, I mean, it leaves me at least to want to complete it and figure out how to piece it all together. And that's what I've ventured to do through internet research that led to podcast research that brought me back to book research. And I kind of got into books at first, but I was so new to everything that, like, you know, this book right here I've had for probably one of the oldest conspiracy books I've had in terms of my life, Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men by Joseph Farrell. And I remember looking through it and thinking, like, what does any of this mean? You know, I had no idea. And I was in, like, you know, just a freshman in college. And now if you ask me about the Nephilim and the giants and all that, I'm like, oh, of course, you know, like, let's talk about it, you know. But but back then it was like these seeds were planted in my garden and I really couldn't see them because they were underground, you know, not hatching, but whatever. People who are, you know, farmers will be like, you're an idiot, but what is it called when the germinate, right? They germinate. These seeds are like germinating underground. You can't see them, and then they blossom into these little delicate things. And you take care of them more and more and more, and then they become, you know, fruit-bearing plants. And that's what these books have become in almost like a psychic way. Like I said, I started with books, went to the internet, went to podcasting, and then podcasting brought me back to books because I realized that there's a lot of information that isn't being talked about on the internet. It's not being talked about in podcasts, but it's in these books. And that's really exciting too, because now with the podcast, I've actually spoken to some of those authors, you know, and figured out like, oh, they're normal people just like me. Like, they're not just like these strange like names that you find in the library. They're actually people, you know. And that was like a big revelation when I started listening to podcasts. Was like, oh wow, like this guy Brad Olson who I've been reading about, now I can like listen to his voice, and then I start reading his book and it's like he's reading it to me. You know, I don't know if everybody has that sort of thing, but it's like a psychic, you know. And again, this is stuff that anybody can do. I'm not trying to say I'm doing anything different or special, but it's certainly like a big part and parcel to why I'm doing what I'm doing, because there's so much information that I found in those books that I'm like, nah, nobody's talking about this. Let's inject this into the crowdsourcing and see what happens, because there's a crowdsourcing effect that's going on in podcasting. It used to happen on the internet until they started locking it down and shutting down certain websites and putting bots in there and all the other disinfo tactics, trolls and all that. But podcasting still has this kind of like authentic feel to it, and you can really be the judge of like what you want to listen to. And I think what that does is it gives the people who are really saying something more credibility. Because like if so many people are resonating with this one person, well, maybe it's because they're speaking the truth, and that's not always the case. I mean, we have people who are disinfo agents for sure, and they rattle things up, and a lot of people unfortunately follow their lead. And I definitely don't want to become anything like that with my show. I try to be very balanced and especially like honest too with the whole political stuff that went on. Like I voted for Obama, I voted for Trump. Like I have to tell you guys the truth about that, because I'm like ashamed of myself, now after some of the guests I've talked to, I'm like, I never want to vote again, like what the hell was I thinking, but that's important, because if I just like kept that to myself and gave everybody who listens to my show the impression that like, oh, I always had it right, they'd just catch on eventually and then nobody will listen to the show. So I'd rather, just be like, hey guys, I fucked up. Like, did you fuck up too? Call into the show and tell me why,
There you go. So. And that's great, man. And like you touched on, that's the authenticity that you talked about, right? People want that realness because there's just so much fakeness out there, so many smoke and mirrors. But when you have someone or a platform like yourself that brings that realness, that truth, man, it's people are attracted to that. That's what people want. We have all this chaos and confusion going on in the world today. People don't know what to think about this. People don't know what to think about that. But when they get someone that's real and brings that authenticity to the table, man, that is something, and that has to be a huge part of the pie why you've been so successful in what you've been doing.
Well, even the name of the show kind of touches on that, and it's funny because like when I got the job working for Sam, and it was a big moment in my life because I had just pretty much been forced out of my old job because of the, mandates and all that, all the things they were forcing us to do at work. I had enough, and I'm like, you know what? Seems like I can do this. Sam hired me. So within like a week or two of becoming like a booker for Sam's spiritual podcast Zero, I had basically started my own podcast, and quit my job as a Amazon delivery driver. And I was doing Lyft, because I wasn't making really much money at all at first. But I remember telling my family, like, yeah, I'm going to do this really cool thing, my new job. I'm a booker. I find weird conspiracy authors for my boss, just trying to use as normal terms as possible to explain this new thing to my family, because they don't listen to podcasts. I mean, maybe one or two of them do. And they just gave me like this blank stare, like, really? This is what you're doing, like, with your life, And that's when it hit me, like, oh, wow. My family thinks I'm crazy. And I just kind of like thought about that as I was driving home that day. And I was so stoked because, like working for Sam. And he had told me in one of our phone conversations, like, oh, what are you doing? What's the name of your show? Like, what are you going to do about that? That's not a good name of the show. Bud Triangle. You should change that up. So I kind of was like, you know what? He's right. I should change the name of my podcast. And that's how My Family Thinks I'm Crazy was born. And I had my buddy Matt join me for my first episode because I wasn't sure how we were going to do it. We talked about like JFK and I didn't really think about how, what was going to happen with the show as far as guests and stuff. I just kind of was like, well, if I talk to Matt, he's been my best friend longer than any of my best friends. So people will really kind of feel my personality, because that's the thing that's hard to do. It's like, when you jump on a show and you're being listened to, it's hard for your like personality, who you want to be heard as, be conveyed, because there's that awkwardness. And that's how I felt going on Sam's show a bunch. So I'm like, if I have Matt with me, my buddy Matt, then I'll joke around with him and that'll get me in the swing of things. And that's kind of why I had my other friends on the show for the first 50 episodes too. because it loosened me up. It like, you know, I was able to bust their balls, they busted my balls. People realized like, oh, this guy Mark, he's just a normal guy. He's humble. People talk shit about him. As a matter of fact, that's all my old co-hosts used to do, was talk shit about me. Like literally, that's all it was. It was just them busting my balls, and that was fun. But it didn't last very long, because I think ultimately the point of the show is to talk about this really deep stuff. And you know, they're just new to it. You know, maybe one day they'll come back around, but they're very new to it. And I got to a point where I'm like, you know, I could have better interviews if I'm just one-on-one with the guest, because I know what I want to talk about. Now, there's sometimes when I have a guest on, and I'm like, shit, I wish I had a co-host here, because I don't know what to say, you know. And that's nothing against the guest. It's just sometimes maybe I smoke too much, or maybe I just, you know, lost my train of thought or something. It's good to have a backup, you know, a wingman, so to speak. But yeah, that's kind of that lended itself to the authenticity of the show, and you know, people who sign up for the Patreon, there's like even more bonus episodes with me and my friends where we're just like literally just talking shit to each other for hours, you know. So there's stuff people can go to get a really like a sense of who I am, my sense of humor when I don't think other people are listening, you know, because the Patreon for a time had nobody subscribed to it. So it was like, yeah, we'll just put whatever there, you know. But yeah, so now I guess this is a way of saying I'm finding my voice, and I'm finding exactly what to talk about on the show. And it's going well, man. I mean, I'm kind of hitting a little bit of a wall lately, because I want to change the format up a little bit and not just do an interview. I want to, I don't know if you're familiar with the Grimerica show, but they do these sort of extended intros. And I was thinking about doing something like that, not quite the same thing. So I've been making the show a little longer, which takes more time out of my week and more time out of my relationships and all the other things that are going on in the world. So it's definitely becoming a full-time job. It's just, you know, still making part-time wages. So we got a hill to climb before I feel like I'm really doing well, but we're starting to do something here. I'm happy how it's gotten off.
Yeah, man, you've been on a hell of a journey, man. You have been on a hell of a journey, and that's awesome, man. It sounds like you asked for truth, and you've gotten it. And you know, like you said, man, the dots are being connected, and one situation is leading to something else, and here you are, right? Now, let's talk about some of those deep conversations, some of those deep, interesting conversations that you have on your podcast show, right? I want to start with something that's been in the news for the last few weeks here, but it finally, I don't want to say it came to an end, but Maxwell, right, was convicted today. You know, as we know, she was Epstein's madam, if you will. What are your thoughts about that entire situation? I think my personal thing is, okay, no surprise she was convicted. When you kind of look at who she's affiliated with and whatnot, you know, I don't know, you know, as far as sentencing, if she's going to get like a slap on the wrist or what, but I would love to hear your thoughts, your opinions on this entire situation with her, and even maybe something about Epstein as well.
Cool. Yeah. I mean, you know, it's tough for me because I'm definitely not like a journalist type. You know, I don't really watch mainstream media, but I did hear about that from a friend today, that she got convicted, and the case is sealed, of course. Nobody's going to know the details. And, you know, I think ultimately whether or not Epstein is alive or not, I can't say. But I know for sure that picture was fucking phony, you know, for sure. I mean, that picture was wild. So I don't know. Yeah, I'm definitely not like, that's the interesting thing about doing what I do for a tinfoil hat is like, I don't know all the details off the top of my head, but when somebody's going through them, I like to think I have a pretty good nose for when somebody's telling a load of crap and when someone's onto something, you know?
Right.
So it's been interesting, you know, with the show, trying to find the right person to talk about that case. And we've gotten a couple interesting guests to cover it. And Sam does a lot of, hey, get this guy on the show. So it's not always me finding everybody. But as far as, you know, what I've found through other shows that I do myself, I do a really cool podcast with the Elemental Philosophorum, Generation Z. We call it the Elemental Philosophorum, where we talk about different elements on the periodic table. And it was interesting that they came up the Maxwell case came up when we talked about lithium, because there are certain technologies that apparently Mrs. Maxwell's father is a part of this company, and even her Terramar project talked about using lithium in these sort of brain chips or like implants, right? So the lithium chip would be powered by the human body, and we could possibly see like the mark of the beast symbolism in that if we wanted to go down that road, which we did on that episode. But yeah, it's interesting to find out, you know, Maxwell, she's got this submarine license and she's doing all this stuff. To me, again, not the expert, but to me, it's very obvious that there are sort of there's a class structure, and there are groups of people who are born into a certain state of wealth and a certain ability to do certain things like become a submarine operator or even a helicopter pilot. I mean, I'm sure anybody could if they wanted to, but there are certain like families that stuff's just a given, you know, and those types of activities are afforded very easily. And they go to schools that are privileged and private and teach them to, you know, activities like that. So it's not a stretch to think that we're living in a nation where there's a group of people who are operating in a civilization with different rules than the one that we're in, you know?
Absolutely.
That's kind of what I think the Epstein stuff reveals and the Maxwell stuff reveals, is that whatever these politicians are connected to, it is, you know, that's not the top. You know, that's the mid-level of the pyramid, and all the groups that are blackmailing them are really behind the power structure. And that's why when an Epstein comes out, they have to put this story out that he got, you know, killed in jail, or he killed himself in jail, or what, you know, that was the official story, that he killed himself. But I mean, we don't know. He could have been killed. I mean, I'm reading, like I pointed out, I think before we started recording, this book by Walter Bosley, and he points out that suicide, that's one of the main ways that they, you know, in espionage, that they cover up murders, is by making it look like a suicide. I mean, from that time period that this book is set, it was way easier to pull something like that off. But there are a lot of fishy things about the whole Epstein story. I mean, the cameras in the cell went out. The, you know, guys who were in charge of security had some strange connections, and yeah, it's you know, it's a deep rabbit hole, as they say. And to me, you know, growing up where I grew up, I'm not surprised at all, because I interacted with, you know, Yale University types, and they think that they walk on, you know, God's green earth while the rest of us are in hell, you know, like they think there's so much, they think they're so much better than us, like the red carpet's rolled out for them. And, you know, I'm not the best with the phrases, but you get what I'm trying to say. Fuck them.
I get what you're trying to say. There you go. I get it, man. Absolutely. I couldn't agree more.
And there's huge disparity too in New Haven. So like, you know, being on the other side of that, it's like you see it. You see the Ivy League. You see it. You're like, oh, okay, these people think they're better than everybody else. And to me, the charities that Maxwell was a part of, and these initiatives to do all these things with the ocean, that's just the cloak that hides the dagger. You know, that's literally all it is. It's a smoke screen. And it's sad because a lot of, you know, again, back to the family thing. I mean, you know, there's people in my family who support certain charities, and I hate to, you know, I don't want to point it out to them, but I want to be like, hey, listen, like, you're not supporting the good guys by doing that, because that's just a front, you know, it's a front for all sorts of projects. Like I mentioned with the climate change thing, kind of touched on that a bit, but with this ocean project, that's the fishiest, I mean, no pun intended, that is the fishiest thing about, you know, Miss Maxwell. It's this Terramar project, and, you know, creating these like weird colonies in the ocean, right? I mean, that's like weird. We know that the international laws like, there's these international laws that apply to the oceans, and like it's almost lawless, right? So it's not surprising that people in that class status system are, you know, trying to skirt around laws and whatnot. But I almost think that that's like not even necessary. Like, they have so much wealth and power. Like, look what they did with this case. You know, it's just a demonstration of that.
Yeah, got it. Now you talked about Maxwell being like mid-level, then you talked about the people at the top of the pyramid that really are running stuff, right?
Well, and I think maybe even like the politicians that we see, because let's keep in mind, like, I don't think they wanted us to know who Epstein and Maxwell were at all, right? So I think they would be examples of people who are above politicians, because it seems like Epstein and her, maybe not her as much as Epstein, but seems like he was blackmailing politicians, right? So
Absolutely.
that kind of puts him in like a kingpin role above them, right? So that's
correct.
kind of more what I was trying to say, not to correct you, because it is, true. But I think they're more like, they're running around as like the middlemen between this kind of top layer that we see and then the top layer that we don't see. So they're somewhere in between.
Okay. Then you mentioned a book talks about, murders are covered up as suicides, right? And then you mentioned a few minutes ago something about a helicopter, and it made me think of something I read on the internet recently where someone said that we're coming up on the 2-year date of Kobe Bryant's death. He died in the helicopter crash, right? And thinking of the suicide type things, and it seems like every time I see a celebrity die, it's like a suicide. Like 9 times out of 10, they find someone that hung themselves in their hotel room or something like that. Then it leads me down this path where I think of like satanic rituals and sacrifices. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think that's real? Do you think that really goes on? And do you think, maybe Kobe Bryant was a sacrifice as part of some type of ritual? I mean, he was in LA, right? This big world-renowned celebrity type guy. But what are your thoughts on satanic rituals and these secret societies? I mean, hey, I think I know what you think about the secret societies because Skull and Bones, right? You live down the street from there. But what are your thoughts on that, man?
I definitely think that, sacrifice or ritual sacrifice, I mean, there's no like theory. It's proven. It's a fact. It's happened throughout cultures. I mean, even as recently as like the 19th century in India, there were temples that were sacrificing virgin boys, that was from the same book. Calcutta, India is the place where that went down. So it's not limited to people who follow Satan by any means. I mean, Kali is the sort of like chaos, destroyer god in the Indian pantheon. And she, again, those kids that were sacrificed in Calcutta were sacrificed in her name, most likely. And, Kali, California, right? So there is some weird association. And again, this is coming from Empire of the Wheel, which is a fascinating book. I definitely encourage people to check out Walter Bosley's work. But without going in and parroting all of his information too much, I think, there's clear evidence that there's these like ritual sacrifices that are taking place on the global stage, so to speak, and celebrities. I mean, even the word celebrity comes from celestial, right? Right? There's that root word association to that. So, and we call them the stars, right? So it's interesting that like these, people become icons, and, the dramas that we used to see in ancient myths are played out in their lives, symbolically, maybe esoterically even, because, it's maybe supposed to be veiled, so it's not obvious, but it can't be too ambiguous because they want to give, people somewhat of a hint, and that's how they remove themselves karmically from the debt, of imposing their will on others, is to give it away, right? Because then it's on us to figure it out, and it's not on them karmically. I've heard a lot of researchers talk about that, but what I find really interesting is how place fits into the equation. And there is that whole thing with Kobe Bryant where the location where the helicopter was downed, tragically crashed, is significant. I don't know if it's the 33rd parallel or the 40th parallel. I think Calabasas, is Calabasas near Los Angeles?
It is right outside of Los Angeles.
So then
northwest. Yeah,
so it's proximal to the 33rd degree line of latitude on the planet, which is extremely significant. And also this neighborhood is somehow connected to the neighborhood that Kobe Bryant went to school in high school when he was a young kid. Again, this is all research from a close friend, actually, Mike Wan. He was on the Higher Side Chats like a month after that happened and broke it all down. So I encourage people to check that out for maybe the whole Kobe breakdown. But yeah, that there is a lot that goes on with like the significance of place when you look at some of these untimely or mysterious deaths. And it seems like to me that there's this earth grid that is almost like an internet of energy in the sense that it connects all places on the planet, right? And when things like a sacrifice are done in these locations, it has a ripple effect across the whole world, and possibly specifically along that grid line, which we know from a bunch of different researchers that certain groups, again, not limited to satanic groups, but a lot, like multiple groups, will build their sacred sites on old sacred sites or existing sacred sites, especially, you know, like the Roman Empire. They would basically, you know, conquer the sacred sites and take them over, repurpose them, change the names of the gods so that people were worshiping the Roman gods instead of whatever god they had conquered, right? So, and then the church does the same thing when they come through and do the Inquisition and take all of the pagans out of Ireland and Great Britain. I mean, that's where a lot of that research comes from, Alfred Watkins and the ley lines. Like, but what's really interesting, again, is that, you know, they're using these significant places to do these things. That, to me, is super exciting because I can go to those places, you know, and investigate myself, and
Right.
Obviously I can't go everywhere, so I hope that people who listen to the show will be inspired to do the same thing, and then with the right head on our shoulders, we can all sort of crowdsource this information, this research, and compile it here on the podcast. That's what I hope to do with my show, Your Handbook for the Apocalypse. And people have been chiming in and saying, hey, I'm from upstate New York and this is what I found here, or yo, I live in you know, Missouri and this is what I found. And so it's cool to get some responses from people in different places and find out like little tidbits. Like I got a buddy who's on the Patreon who lives out in Ohio, you know, so the serpent mounds are definitely significant for him, but he's found some other cool stuff that he's shown me, like this really weird tree. Like I thought this tree was cool. I don't know, maybe it's not that special, but it's like a weird tree that you can stand inside of, right? And I know everybody on the Telegram's like looking at this picture, and like one guy's like, oh, that could be this, and another person's like, no, it looks like this. So it's just it's becoming really fun to like, maybe we don't have all the conclusions, but the fact that everybody's like crowdsourcing this research, I'm really excited to participate in it. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of straying away from your question though. On the point of like ritual sacrifices and them being satanic, I make that clarification because, you know, I think there's a lot of like hype and panic around the satanic panic. I mean, literally the panic, but also, I mean, that could have been weaponized because there are real cases like what happened at that preschool and, you know, some other really awful things, the finders, right? So there are really scary and unsettling examples of those kind of things happening. But I think when we get into the realm of like whether or not it's satanic or not, it becomes more of a smokescreen than anything because there's just so much religious association with it that, like, I don't know. It just, you know, I think it's doing the point of justice a disservice to exaggerate or embellish, right? Because we need to know the facts, right? So and that just seems to be the case with the satanic stuff, and especially when Christians talk about it. Again, you know, I'm not a fan of that at all, and I think really like someone that I'd refer to as Chris Knowles, he's done a lot of really good research to show that a lot of these cults are actually Mithraic cults and not satanic cults. And then there's other folks who talk about how Lucifer is, you know, possibly just an idea, not an actual, you know, being, you know. So it's really murky, and I don't want to claim to be an expert on it at all because, you know, people are, you know, it's up to them. If they experience something that they want to call Lucifer or Satan, like, my heart goes out to you. I pray for you. I hope you're all right. You know, like, I'm not going to deny that you had that experience, you know, because you might have.
Their reality.
That's
their reality, man.
Yeah, but as far as I'm concerned, like, I don't want to let that in my reality, so I don't really, like, I don't see into that duality, like, oh well, if there's a God, then there has to be like an antithesis to him, and like the devil. And I think on a like metaphysical level, like the yin yang back there, that's at play. And I think the fear of evil has been used against the common man to create obedience towards these people who claim to be the middleman towards whatever is good. So like at the same time that they're like, you can find God through us, all they talk about is who the devil is. It's just very like, and I'm not anti-religious. I grew up Catholic, so I don't have like any kind of association with that anymore, because it didn't vibe with me. But I don't like, I've had a lot of Christians on the show, and I don't dismiss that worldview at all. I think it's totally open, and we all have our own journey to take and our own perspective to make. But when it comes to like an evil being who's lurking in the shadows, I think there are demons that we can invite into our life, and that you don't want to do that. That's not something I'd ever recommend. And I think there are groups that use those relationships with dark entities like that to their advantage. I don't think it works out in the end, because there is no high road with those beings. They're just going to use you and abuse you, and the next thing you know, confuse you, and then you think you were being helped into becoming like the Mr. Doomsday or whatever, and you just end up being like a sad, pathetic magician or whatever, wizard, dark wizard or something. I kind of beat up on Crowley a lot, but there's so much information on him that it's impossible to be like he was this or that. Like, you can't take a black or white approach to Aleister Crowley. He's definitely in the gray, and
oh yeah, definitely.
He's somebody who, I'll admit, I definitely kind of like beat up on him a little bit, but he gets a bad rap, and it's kind of due to this hysteria, this extremism of polarity that's played on by the powers that be. And, I don't want to say that he didn't do anything evil, because I don't know, but it seems to me like his whole aim was to just expose a lot of this stuff for whatever reason. I don't know. I think now I'm starting to think he was a secret agent or something, but at the end of the day, there's like I just don't put a lot of credit in the idea that like satanic cults are ruling the world. I think that there are groups that are trying to rule the world, and they're probably battling one another, and they might have like demons that possess them from time to time, and they try to like use that as a weapon. I mean, it happens. You could look at like South America and North America and shamans for that. There's a lot of stories about certain shamans who will use like evil magic to hurt people, right? They'll go into a dream and like, kill that person in a dream, and the next thing you know, like the person like dies in their sleep or something weird. Like I don't doubt that is possible or real, but I think, again, with that whole karmic thing that people talk about when it comes to the world stage, mass rituals and whatnot, a law of returns, like anything you put out comes back to you threefold. So if you're putting out evil, that's going to come back to you threefold no matter what. There's no there's no win in that when you take that road. So to me, it seems like educating people is the only way to fight evil, because they only thrive by keeping people into the dark about what they're really doing, and kind of leaving it on us karmically to figure it out. But if we're not taught the tools, we don't figure it out, and they just go on kind of taking advantage of the way the energy works in the world, because they're the only ones who have true knowledge of how it operates, right? So this becomes like this like parasitic being on the rest of us.
Damn, well said, man. Well said. And Mark, you brought up demons a couple times, right? You mentioned that a couple times over the last few minutes here. And then you also mentioned shamans as well, right? And that definitely resonated with me, because I had an experience back in April of this year where I went out to the desert in Tucson and participated in a 3-night ayahuasca ceremony with the shaman and his crew and about 30, 40 other people, which was life-changing, to say the least, right? Now, do you believe that there is some type of spiritual warfare going on right now based off everything we're seeing, from COVID and the jab. For example, I spoke with David Icke earlier this year, and he was of the thought that the whole jab COVID thing is related in a spiritual way, where the disease or the vax, they're like these, how did he say, like this negative energy, or these entities, if you will. And if the more you fear, the more that other fears, including that disease, will come and attach to you, But one of the things that I experienced during my 3-night ceremony there it was revealed to me, and again, this is my reality, that there is a spiritual warfare going on, right? Not only both in the spiritual world and here. A phenomenal experience, and I can tell you more about that later, but in a nutshell, I walk with God, the Father, for 3 nights in the desert, man. It was just completely unbelievable. And I'm not a religious guy. I grew up in the church. My mom's a evangelist, a licensed evangelist. But like you, I got away from religion. So I consider myself just maybe a spiritualist, more so spiritual. And, I do a ton of meditating, which I started doing last year. And that's really changed my life as well. I'm into crystal work, and I have my little sacred space here in my house. And even through my meditations, I've seen entities. I have had out-of-body experiences as well. But I really want to know how you feel in regards to what I asked with the spiritual warfare going on. Is that, if so, if you believe that, is that linked to what we've been seeing going on in the world on such a high level over the last 18 to 20 months?
I'm glad you shared that with me. That's really profound. I myself have never done ayahuasca or DMT, so I've never experienced that level, but I have done mushrooms a fair bit, a couple times where I kind of like went into, I don't know, like a tunnel of light, but I've never like broken through quite the way people describe with DMT or ayahuasca, or maybe like even mescalito. But it's interesting, when you brought up ayahuasca, my first thought was David Icke, and then you brought up David Icke and having a conversation with him, because I just find it so fascinating that this is like a theme with folks like David Icke. And David, I mean, is huge for everybody, obviously being such a loud and prominent conspiracy voice for so long. I mean, like literally, he's done a huge service, whether you agree with him or not, just as a truth seeker. It's funny. That's the other book I have on my desk, is his book.
There it is.
So it's weird that came up just now, but yeah, I think it's interesting how many people have had these ayahuasca experiences, and then they come out seeing this new world. I mean, not that I want to be like paranoid or black-pilled, but that does make me a little suspicious sometimes. But then again, I'm almost like, there's something to that. And the fact that ayahuasca comes from the jungle in this sacred way, and the shamans even talk about having this really special relationship with the plant itself, where, it was almost divine to them, like in a Prometheus type of way, like how to blend these two plants together out of the infinite number of plants that grow in the rainforest, especially the Amazon rainforest. They were able to combine these two, the one, being Banisteriopsis, that has that MAOI inhibitor in it, right? Which is what allows the DMT to really connect with your receptors there in the stomach. I think that's absolutely fascinating, and maybe that's a reason why I don't really have as much suspicion, because I'm kind of a hippie. Like, I kind of go with the natural flow. I think that there's something to it when it comes to nature. Like, I try to stick to the most holistic diet, holistic medicine, and be out in nature as much as I can. And if that makes me biased, so be it. But that to me is interesting. And again, like the machine elf stuff and like all the DMT, Rick Strassman stuff, that's when I become a little suspicious of it all. But it is interesting, that many people who are truth seekers have had that experience. And to answer your question about the spiritual war, I think it's exactly how I put it with my previous answer. Just I'll rephrase it for this question. But there is a embargo on the truth. There is a group in a pyramidal sort of structure way that rests above the rest of us and holds certain things back from the majority so that we remain in this comfortable state of ignorance, just enough to be pleasant little worker bees, and they can arrange society as they please. And I don't think that that's a way I want to live my life at all, being in someone else's hive. If anything, we operate that way inherently as psychic sort of organisms. If you believe in that, I kind of have been believing in that more and more as the podcast goes on, because I'm like seeing more info coming to me from people that I'm connecting with, in this kind of hyper connected way that's not really possible just from walking around your hometown your whole life. Like, I don't know, I've been in the same place. I've traveled, but I've been in the same place for too long, I'll just say that. So the podcasting community is a huge welcome, and it's interesting to see like how quickly you can step into another reality, and that's what they're trying to keep from us. They're trying to keep us from this other reality that's possible at any moment now. Like right now, for the listener listening to this, and for me and you talking, there is a now moment, the nexus point of everything, where everything you've ever experienced exists. It's inevitably in the now. There's no past, there's no future, it's always now.
Exactly.
Right? The future and the past, they're just concepts that we use to describe what we've been through, but or what we're gonna go through, but it's going to happen in the now regardless, whether you're talking about something that happened, now in the future, or whether you're hoping something happens then. It's always in this now moment, and that's what they're putting an embargo on, is the understanding of that, the physics of that, how it operates, and this kind of subtle, I would call it like a level up, not to get into like the whole evolution thing, because like climate change, that's a whole dicey topic too. But I think there is a sort of spiritual evolution that is supposed to take place. And maybe even, I've heard some researchers put it like our 2 strands of DNA is not complete, and we should have 12 strands of DNA. And like, as we evolve, we would have had that many by now, but something happened in pre-Babylonian times where our DNA was altered, and now we're sort of stuck in this 3rd dimensional paradigm. I don't discount that as much as I don't believe in it, but I also like, it's very neutral. I'm like, that could be true, but also like that's a little out there. It just seems to me like with the small amount of work I've done, I can kind of lay it out in a couple of steps. Crystals coming in my life, water, purifying it and only drinking clear, pure spring water, smoking cannabis daily, which is not, recommendation, but it worked for me. And then, every now and then mushrooms. And, I don't know what it is, but I've since that had a shift occur. And I think that's what they've been trying to block people from, is living this kind of, not, I don't want to say I'm enlightened, but I'm on my way to it, or at least I think it's possible. And I'm hoping that it's possible for me, because I see really brilliant people, some people who actually, host podcasts, or people who guest on podcasts, as a matter of fact, who seemingly have achieved those elevated states of consciousness or enlightened states of being in the world. And I think that's always possible. And what you kind of alluded to with the COVID thing, that's like a big indicator of it. The fear, and the masks and like the injections and all this stuff. Right. It's all meant to, A, corrupt your body, which that's a whole topic that I'm not an expert on. And we won't get too far into that. But B, really get people afraid of each other, which is the opposite of what we need. Because like that kind of hive thing that I was mentioning, we do operate in that hive mentality. And when we're all operating correctly, I don't know if, I'm not trying to say there's one or just one way to live your life or be a good person. But when we're all, sort of working towards a common goal that is altruistic, there is a sort of positive multiplying effect that happens, and they don't want that to happen, because that's how that's how waves of people get awakened all at once. You know, they're okay if a couple people figure it out. You know, they can manage the few geniuses like Tesla and like, you know, people who come up out of nowhere, and you know, they can kind of like, for a while they could like write them off as quacks and put out bad press, or call them like the Antichrist, or like Napoleon's a good example of that. I mean, we remember Napoleon as a short, fat, angry tyrant or whatever they told us in school, but that's all British propaganda. Like that, he wasn't even short. Like he wasn't, you know, like by all accounts, he was like a interesting person. Like if he was around in our times, he would probably be on a podcast, to be honest, talking about the same stuff we're talking about. Like he was interested in finding all this hidden esoteric knowledge, you know, and that's
really?
like, he used his like military abilities to, you know, create that possibility. You know, obviously he had a lot more leeway than the average person in those times to go to other countries and find all this stuff. You know, he had a whole army at his disposal. But yeah, again, you know, that's coming from Walter Bosley's work. I've been looking into him a lot lately. Hopefully we'll get him on the show soon. But you know, that's the other thing that's cool about this new reality we're in, is there's so many brilliant people offering all these different perspectives and pieces of information that I'm happy just kind of absorbing it all and showing people, you know, what I find most interesting, and maybe they'll send some stuff back my way. But that seems to be where the show's going, you know, just having interesting conversations with interesting people.
Sounds good, man. And that's what I love about my show, man. The ability, or the opportunity, I should say, to learn, talking to so many different interesting people and getting their perspectives on various topics. It's like, man, it's phenomenal. It's phenomenal, man. It really is. One of the final questions I want to ask you, Mark, is it wouldn't be right if I didn't ask you about aliens, man. I want to what's your thoughts on aliens, man? You know,
all right.
I really think you have some interesting things to say about that. So what are your takes on what are your take on aliens?
Well, I've said a lot about aliens, I think, on some shows. So I hope I'm not like going back on anything I've said, but you know, I find the subject super fascinating. Who doesn't? It was like one of the big points of interest for me when I was a kid, and slowly, as I learned more and more, I became, you know, more interested in other equally weird things, and then like a show like Ancient Aliens kind of really made me question the whole topic in general, because I was like, well, why would they talk about this on TV? You know, at first I loved it. I watched every episode whenever it was on, and then there came a point when I kind of became like disenfranchised from just media in general and just only listen to podcasts, and I really kind of like started absorbing all these other opinions about aliens, and I'm like, oh, okay, that's interesting. Like, and now I've started to think like, oh, well, I don't think the aliens could have built the pyramids. I think humans did it, maybe with the help of aliens, or like with technology that might seem alien to us, but like part of me finds it way more interesting to think like there's an ancient culture that we, you know, descended from that built that stuff, and who knows, maybe they were aliens, like maybe they came from another planet, you know. So I'm always like tossing around these different ideas, and like sometimes, like, I think really why I said I don't want to go back on anything is because I have said in the past that like I don't think they're like from another planet. I think they're from another multiverse, or they're from another dimension, you know. And they're coming in through like a portal or something that we're not quite aware of, because for the longest time the propaganda has told us, oh, they're on Mars, they're flying around in these ships, and you know, there's all kinds of information that might suggest that it's human beings in those UFOs. I mean, if you look at like where the flying airships were in the 1800s, it's not really that far of a stretch to think, you know, oh, maybe humans developed this technology from the point of like what looked like a big clunky Zeppelin down to, you know, a shiny disc UFO. I mean, if you look at it, it's only 100 years, right? In the 1850s, they were building these Zeppelins, and then 100 years later, we have Roswell, we have disc sightings. You look at the way they built the car, it's kind of the same progression. You see a Model T, and then you compare that to like those like three-wheeled cars they have rolling around now, like those, like, what are they, I don't know what they're called, but like guy with the open seats, and guys are always driving them with their babe, like with music blaring, you know, like
a trike almost.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or even just like something like a Lamborghini, or like even a Tesla, you know, like the difference between those cars and like the Model T in that many years, 100 years almost now. I mean, if you put that same line of thinking into airships, it could be conceivably possible that there's like human beings that developed it from a Zeppelin technology to a airship, like a flying saucer. So that, to me, like, I find those interesting, or those explanations of this type of stuff more interesting than like, oh, they come from another planet. What they are, I mean, again, human beings seem to have interacted with these types of entities for much longer than just Roswell, you know, like
that's right.
That's the other side of it. Like, that's what makes me think they're maybe multidimensional. Because yes, we hear a lot of stories of, oh, beings came from the stars, but there's also cultures that talk about, you know, they're gods coming from the ocean, you know, and then there's other groups that talk about their gods like coming out of a big burst of fire and smoke. You know, to me that sounds like technology, or you know, a submarine in the latter case, right, or the former case. So like, yeah, there's so many angles you can go with the alien question that I'd hate to ever feel like I have I've made a conclusive statement about it, because I'm so open-minded to what it is. I'm really, I think in the early state, like I'm at episode 120 right now. I think by episode 300, I'll have a better idea of what I think aliens are. We got to talk to some more people.
Funny. I hear you, man. That's a great answer, man. That really is. I like it, man. Well, hey, man, one last thing here. One thing that I ask each and every guest that comes on the Hidden Gateway podcast to do is to leave our listeners with what I like to call a token of love, right? Something that they can take forward with them as they go along their journey. And whatever words they may be, it can be a minute long, it can be 5 minutes long, whatever resonates with it, whatever's in your heart to do, man. But just based off your experiences and what you've learned along your journey, what would you like to share with the Hidden Gateway listeners?
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for giving me an opportunity to do that. I think I'll maybe connect my answer back to something I kind of touched on a little bit, which is being in the now, you know, and I guess something I'll leave people with is like, be present in the present to receive the presence of presence, right? And like, that's kind of like a little bit of a tongue twister, but it means, you know, when you're in the present, you know, with presence, as in having awareness for what you're doing, how you're interacting with the world, where you're going in life, you know, what your purpose is, those kind of things. Have those answers, or at least be looking for them. And that's where, you know, you need to be to find the answers, is in the present, right? So that's where the receiving the presence comes in, is in this kind of synchro mystic way, which is not a term I coined by any means, but it's a term that I resonate with really deeply. It, like, in this synchronistic kind of way, you find certain little clues that point you in a direction, maybe way out of the job you're in that you hate right now, or maybe it's a way, you know, into another, you know, place to live, or whatever, you know, you're personally looking for in life at this particular moment. I think if you really get like down to the root of who you are, and all those answers are squared out, or at least, you know, you're striving to square those answers out, then you can start to be like present in this ever present moment that is the ever expanding now, you know. So, and I'm not an expert, but I've had a couple of like interesting people on the show, and yeah, again, like maybe by episode 300 I'll have a better answer. I'll talk to some more interesting people, but like you said, you know, that's the cool thing about doing stuff like this, is we learn a lot from each other with these conversations. So hopefully I'll have you on my show one day to learn some things about you and what you've been up to in life, because we always like to ask, you know, like, what was the first thing that got you into conspiracies? And I can tell just by the name of the show, The Hidden Gateway, that you're definitely getting into a lot of stuff. I got to go back and listen, but yeah, brother, I hope that was good enough. Be present in the present. and receive the presence of presence. That would be my answer.
Man, oh man, let's not talk about good enough, brother. That was perfect, and that really hit hard when you said getting to the root of who you are, man. I felt it right here, and that's good, man. Thank you so much. Perfect. So tell our listeners where they can find you. Obviously, you have your website, myfamilythinksimcrazy.com, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and you got a lot going on your website. Obviously, there's the episodes and where you've been on other shows, but you have like a couple other sections there too. You sell some merch and different things. Yes?
Yeah, and thank you again. I'm glad that resonated with you because it's something that I try to put into practice in my life, and it's definitely come in handy. And I can't say it's worked all the time, but yeah, definitely helps. And if people like the show or like what I have had to say or brought to this show, then definitely go and check out my website, myfamilythinksimcrazy.com. And I do make these, I've been trying to do this more often, make these like crystal wraps.
Oh, those are on the website too?
So yeah, I've been selling a couple of these on the website now. Man. And yeah, thanks for giving me an opportunity to plug that. I don't have like merch just yet as far as like t-shirts go. I forget what the name of the website is, but I have it. It's going to come out on my website soon. So if people are interested in getting a shirt that says "My Family Thinks I'm Crazy" on it, I mean, definitely check that out. And yeah, this has been a lot of fun, man. I got a lot of shows I do, and Alt Media United is the podcast cooperative, which I would love to have you a part of. This show would definitely fit in with the other shows that we have, and the goal is to build a community of podcasters. Like I said at the beginning, we're all doing this kind of independently on our own dime, and when you're a part of a community of people who have audiences already, and you can do shows with them and share ideas and share little tips on how to do things differently, I think that's a win-win for everybody. So that's kind of what I strive to create when I set out to make Alt Media United. It's a website where you can find a bunch of cool podcasts that, if you're in the need for more podcasts in your life, definitely go and check us out, altmediaunited.com.
altmediaunited.com. You heard it, good people. And then social media too. I think you have an IG page. Are you on Facebook?
Yep.
Twitter, all that good stuff?
All that is on the website, I think. I don't actually know. It's not Twitter. We got a Twitter, which is a good way to stay in touch with the live streams that we've been trying to do more often on Rockfin, and that's free for people who don't have Rockfin yet. You can check out our live stream for free, and then once the live stream's over, we put it behind the paywall there on Rockfin. So definitely check us out there if you like that kind of stuff. And then Telegram would be like the biggest social media. People hit me up on Instagram, that's great, but if they join the Telegram group, that's even better, because like I can't do it alone, and we got some really awesome people in the Telegram that I've become friends with or over the past few weeks and whatnot since I got it going. They're all really good people, really cool people. And yeah, it's like, people hit me up on Instagram or email, and I can't get back to everybody. I'm trying to in the extended outros that I'm doing now. But yeah, I definitely like to encourage people to join the Telegram, because then at least if I don't get back to you, one of My Family Thinks I'm Crazy lunatics will.
Somebody will. That's awesome, my friend. That is awesome. So you guys heard it. Check my man Mark out. MyFamilyThinksI'mCrazy.com. As I said at the beginning of this show, freaking great podcast with great guests and lots of great, interesting conversations. So I encourage everyone to check it out. And I know you all couldn't see that. I guess it was like a crystal necklace. Well, it's a just go to the website. You'll see it. It looks pretty smooth.
Thank you.
Mark, I want to thank you once again, my friend, for being a guest here on the Hidden Gateway podcast. This has been fun, excellent. I've really enjoyed it. And to our audience, to our listeners, we hope you enjoyed this episode of the Hidden Gateway podcast as well. Remember, you can stay connected with us at thehiddengateway.com. You can contact us at support@thehiddengateway.com as well to chat, ask questions, anything you need. Do not forget to subscribe to our YouTube station as well, YouTube channel, I should say. And until next time, remember, as always, stay positive, stay questioning, be love, and be free. The Hidden Gateway out.
Mark, welcome to Forbidden Knowledge News. How are you doing?
I'm good, man. Thanks for having me. Nice to be here.
Yes, excellent to have you. I had a great time on your show. My family thinks I'm crazy. And we're going to have a great time today, man. We're going to go down some crazy rabbit holes, talk about some of the topics you and I both cover and love. And we're going to, like I said, we're going to have some fun. And I want to start with, this is your first time on, Mark. What was it that led you down the road less traveled of podcasts?
So podcasting, that's a good question. It started really with, funny enough, Spotify had the Joseph Campbell archives in like their like weird, verbal section or vocal section, because I was like just tooling around on Spotify like in 2011, and I found all the Joseph Campbell archives, and I had never really listened to anything in that way before, and I had a job dishwashing at the time, so I would just go to work, dishwash, and listen to the Joseph Campbell archives for like hours at a time. And at the same point in my life, I was kind of exploring Aleister Crowley, Israel Regardie, Blavatsky, and any other weird occult book I could get my hand on at that moment in time. So podcasting kind of came, funny enough, like after I found the show Stuff They Don't Want You to Know, and I liked them, but then I started to feel like they were a little too corporate, and that's around the time when I found Tinfoil Hat, and all of the shows that came after that really were a result of Tinfoil Hat, because I think I heard Greg on that show. I started listening to the Higher Side, and then it just like is like a dendritic rooting,
Right, yeah.
It branches off, and now I have like, 3 dozen podcasts that I listen to, so and I have my own. But it was really, an act of synchronicity, because, as a fan of Tinfoil Hat, I guess I'm kind of going a little beyond your question, but maybe if you were interested in knowing how my podcast got started, it was kind of an act of synchronicity, because I ended up, finding Tinfoil Hat, falling in love with it, and just really liking that show for whatever reason, and Sam's vibe. And I wanted to give him the Kabbalion, the 7 Hermetic laws, because I felt like, if this guy knew this might change the show, and bring this element into the show, because I felt like Sam was covering all like the dark stuff and the wild rabbit hole stuff, but he had only just gotten into the alternative history, ancient history type stuff. And he was talking about the simulation theory a lot. So I'm like, you know what? If he had the 7 Hermetic laws, it would bring like a whole new angle to this simulation theory thing, right? So long story short, I ended up seeing him after a show, and I gave him the book, and that was it. I'm just like, you know what? Hope he reads it. He probably won't. And then sometime later, I was on his Patreon, and I noticed he was talking about, some book that somebody gave him. So I asked him in the chats, I'm like, hey, did you read the book that I gave you? And told him which one it was. And he was like, no, but you should come on the show and tell me about it. So I'm like, well, shoot. All right, cool, man. So I joined him on his Patreon and talked to him about, instead of the Kabbalion, I talked to him about Skull and Bones, and kind of shared some of the insights on how I got up to speed on the conspiracies from a really young age. Dropping out of college and trying to forge my own way was largely inspired by all the conspiracy and metaphysical knowledge that I was learning at that time. But yeah, long story short, Sam kind of gave me an opportunity to be on his paywall show multiple times. And then I had this opportunity to drive a friend to the airport down in Virginia. I live in Connecticut, so Virginia's like 5-6 states away. I had never been to Virginia ever before, but she needed a ride to the airport, and she was going to give me a couple $100 for it. And I'm like, awesome. This is a great opportunity to go check out the Susquehanna River, check out Washington, D.C. These are places that I've been learning about through researchers like Michael Wan and many others. So I really like, in a synchronistic way, I think I connected myself to the Susquehanna River, because on my way back from Virginia, I stop at the Susquehanna. I stop right at the shore. I found some weird little parking lot on the edge of the river, and I just, threw some tobacco in the water like I had learned from a mentor of mine back in the day, and just connected like on a spiritual level with the river. And funny enough, man, like 6-7 months later, I'm talking to Michael Wan on my podcast, you know, and it's like it all kind of came together in a way where I didn't really realize that's what I was doing when I set that intention to connect. You know, I was really connecting with the outside world. So, I mean, I could probably, and I have talked about all the little details of the synchronicities that led up to being the podcast hoster that I am now. But, you know, I think synchronicity is the long and short of it.
For sure, man. You got to follow those synchronicities. I learned that very quickly along my journey as well. You got to pay attention to all these little things happening around you, because they can lead you down beautiful paths if you really pay attention to what's happening around you, for sure. Right. But I want to know about the other side of your journey, your spiritual and personal journey. And you said you had learned about conspiracies and, you know, the nature of reality wasn't really what we're told from a young age. How did that come about? How did you learn about, you know, what was going on? So
I've always been an odd person, an odd kid, you know. I definitely didn't fit in.
Same here.
I remember like stopping a pier from like crushing ants and like saving the ants and getting this reputation for being like an animal lover hippie, and that didn't bother me one bit because I loved animals. I loved being outside, and I mention that because I feel like without that at a young age, I don't know if any of the conspiracy spiritual stuff would have ever come about, because my love for nature, my love for the outside world really compelled me to see what was wrong about our society in a way that I think most of my peers weren't, maybe just in my community. I'm sure there were others that I wasn't connected with, like yourself at that time. But, you know, it was very apparent to me that there was not a harmonious relationship between humanity and the earth. So that was like the first kind of conspiracy, and it brought me into being kind of like this liberal hippie-ish type. And I used to clash with my grandfather because he was a big Fox News, Bush era, you know, war hawk type person, and that was a big contention. And I became very anti-establishment because of that, and kind of gravitated towards anti-establishment speakers and thinkers like Alan Watts and Terence McKenna. Started smoking pot, and that's when the occult and the metaphysical stuff really became more than just like speculation, because I had a tangible experience of it. And really, like, I used to describe it as like my slate got wiped clean and I saw the world with new eyes, you know, and that was mostly thanks to cannabis. But again, big in part, my fascination and love for nature and really trying to understand the world in an empathetic way. Now, how conspiracy found its way into that was, again, looking for anti-establishment type role models. I met this guy in the park in New Haven, the city I went to school in for community college. And I'm just sitting there smoking joints between classes, just trying to keep my mind off of the BS and take some time to read. I think I was reading like Secret History of the World by Mark Booth around that time, and I was really into Carlos Castaneda's work at that time. So when I ran into this guy named Amos, who was from Arizona, a Native American himself, and I was reading Michael Harner, I was reading Carlos Castaneda, I'm like, oh, wow, this guy, you know, he's different, you know. There's not a lot of folks like him where I'm from. So the fact that he wanted to talk to me because I was smoking a joint, I'm like, oh, what's up, man? So we broke bread, we started talking, and this guy ended up telling me, like, you know, I used to be in prison, and, you know, one of the reasons why I came to Connecticut from Arizona was because when I got out of prison, I felt like I had done my family and my community, my people, a really bad, like I really owed them, you know, big tribute, because I had wronged my community so much. You know, I couldn't just go back and live my old life in Arizona. I had to leave, you know, I had to leave and make things right. And the way he made things right was by coming to New Haven, Connecticut, where Yale University has Geronimo's skull and bones grave robbed in their skull and bones tomb on High Street, right? I'm sure you're familiar. A lot of people are familiar with this story in the conspiracy realm. Prescott Bush in the 1800s participated in a grave robbery of Geronimo Pratt's grave site in Oklahoma near Fort Sill, and they brought that to New Haven, Connecticut. So Amos, who probably knew about this story for some time before he went to prison, he really set out to make it like a spiritual pilgrimage, you know, like to right the wrongs of his life by praying for Geronimo in his disinterred state, right? So he's disinterred, and Amos, what he would do at that time when I met him, I don't know if he still does this, but every day at noon, he would go and stand in front of the High Street tomb, right? You can look it up online. If you look up Skull and Bone, the tomb, they have this odd-looking Egyptian sort of styled building right in the middle of town, in the center of the city. And Amos would go there and he would scream, Geronimo, like so loud that it would reverberate through, you know, the walls of the campus, and the students would like grip their books in fear, like, what the heck is this guy screaming about? And I had the, you know, honor of standing with him one day when he did that, when he decided I was, you know, ready to see that kind of thing for whatever reason. But it really felt like, you know, I was taken under his wing. You know, like he was my shaman, you know, and like we didn't do any like crazy peyote stuff, but he told me about his peyote experiences, and you know, we would meet each other in that kind of liminal space, because like he didn't have a phone, and phones weren't really that, you know, up the way they are now in 2012. So like it wasn't like that. Like I would just go to the park and he would either be there or he wouldn't, you know, and we would either talk for a few hours or we wouldn't, you know. So I really like kind of had this underground education from this guy. And I remember like valuing it so much, like really like appreciating the fact that this guy and I had met. And then when I started telling my family, like, you know, my mom, my grandma, like, oh, yeah, I have this friend. He's homeless. He lives in New Haven and he teaches me stuff. They're like looking at me like I'm a nut. Like I've lost, like I fell off of, you know, the cart, and like something's wrong with me. And like, you know, because of this homeless man, I have, you know, run risk of becoming like a, you know, a loser or something. Because at that point I was really considering dropping out of school. And, you know, it wasn't just Amos. I had other friends who were kind of like, oh, yeah, you can get your debts forgiven. Like your school debts can be forgiven, which ended up not being true. So all of that led up to me, you know, really just becoming disenfranchised with the school system and the indoctrination programming. And I just set out to educate myself because, you know, here was this guy who had all this wisdom from another land that I had read about. And he just synchronistically came into my life at a really pivotal time. And I thought, well, if that happened once, it's going to keep happening. And I just need to like stay on that track and really just like give into that energy and not be afraid that I'm going to, you know, end up a loser if I don't do what my parents are compelling me to do by staying in school or becoming a fucking plumber or an electrician or whatever else, you know, my father thought I could do. And, you know, still, I don't think they're quite proud of me yet, but I'm on my way to do that. Maybe the podcast is a part of it. And I had no clue back then that that's what this would amount to. I mean, how could you? I don't even think they were really that popular back then. At least I wasn't aware of them. But yeah, so that's like the long way around for like actual, because I had, you know, seen loose change on the internet and I had seen all the conspiracy stuff on the internet, but it was that person in person who conveyed that real pain, like of like this guy, Geronimo, my ancestor, a really tragic thing happened to him. And it was so stark because, you know, nobody respects that kind of thing, at least in our Western culture, you know, like you don't really consider, you know, after a funeral, a person's life that much, you know. I feel like, especially someone you're not related to or far removed related to. So there's just this sort of reverence for the dead, and that I learned there too. And so many things happened after that just totally added more confirmation that I was on the right path, you know. And I ended up actually delivering bread in New Haven, which gave me a whole nother level of it, because then I was kind of given an all access pass to the university without being a student. So when I would go on deliveries, I would kind of sneak off and poke around and look around and see what I can find. And one really amazing synchronicity that occurred during this time period in my life was I had this regular delivery every Tuesday. And the funniest thing was like the front door was always locked, and they wanted like 6 trays of like donuts, coffee, and all these other pastries that the bakery would make. So it was kind of a hassle. I would put everything on the front steps, and then I would sneak in through the back window. Like there was a window that like led to like this little courtyard thing. It wasn't like a glass window. It was like a open air kind of thing. You'd climb through, go down to this courtyard, and this door was never locked. So I would basically break into this building to do this delivery. And it was always kind of fun and enjoyable, and I like felt like a spy and whatnot. So one day, I think it was like 2018, I go into the building, same way I always do, and I look down at the floor, and there's a newspaper on the floor that says, George H.W. Bush dies today. Former Yale University graduate, former resident of New Haven, famously lived at 88 Hill House Avenue. Well, God, Chris, I'll tell you, that's the exact building I was in, 88 Hill House Avenue. So I'm reading that George H.W. Bush lived in the house that I had been breaking into every Tuesday to deliver these pastries. So it's like little synchronicities like that constantly remind me like, okay, you're onto something, keep going with this. And around that time was when I really pushed myself to learn as much as I could. And, I'm still on my way to doing that. I'm really in the collection phase right now, just trying to collect the books and collect the theories. And as I get older, I'll sort it all out. But yeah, that's kind of where I've been, in the Connecticut realm of conspiracies.
That's cool, man, because you had an opportunity to kind of learn about this stuff at an earlier age. And like the way you said it, you kind of collecting it all and going to sort through it as you get older. I think that's a great way to do it because, the older you get, the more insights you have into not only the things that you're looking into, but your own, attachment to it and your own connections to these things and how they affect you and other people in your lives. And yeah, it's a great growing experience to have been able to have been exposed to that stuff so early. So that's really cool. Now, as far as some of the experiences you've had in your life to kind of solidify that, maybe talk about have you had any like unexplained paranormal experiences or anything that was like super profound that sticks out in your mind?
Yeah. So along with Amos and that whole time period when I was friends with him, because, like I said, he didn't have a phone and we eventually lost touch. And now he's not homeless. He lives in a place, and I'm not sure if he still lives there, but I had visited him. But anyways, around the time when I met him, he told me this story about a red-tailed hawk. And, I didn't really pay much mind to it. And I had friends who were teaching me about crystals and whatnot, and I was really fascinated with selenite. Selenite was always kind of like special to me because you can kind of see through it. It's very bright white, and it just had this quality that the other crystals that I had didn't. So I would take this selenite and meditate with it. And one day, smoking some weed and getting like pretty high, like higher than normal, like almost out of body high. And I go into my backyard, which was semi-forested, and again, kind of rare in my town. There's no big backyards like this. For whatever reason, there's like a little alley of forest in my backyard in my childhood home. So I would go down this like alleyway of forest and hang out and smoke weed and all that. So I'm back there holding selenite, and it's summertime, so I don't have like barely any clothes on, just like martial arts pants, because I used to wear my karate pants all the time. And I'm just sitting there trying to zone in. And I zone in, and all of a sudden I white out. And I say white out because it wasn't quite a blackout where you like lose consciousness and everything's black. I like lost consciousness, but the light flooded in. And it was bright. I was in a clearing, so it was the sun too, but I was all white in my mind, which I'd never experienced that before. I'd fainted before, and I'd always been like a blackout, and this was white. And I wake up from this whiteout, and I look over to my left, and floating on the tall grass, like literally being like tickled up by the tall grass, was this red-tailed hawk feather, like pristine, perfect. And I knew exactly what it was because my friend had just told me a sort of story about this. And I go to him the next day and I'm like, hey, Amos, check this out. And he's like, brother, that's a good sign, you know? And I'm like, what do you mean? He's like, well, you're the second person that has brought me a red-tailed hawk feather. And he's like, and you're the third person that I've been teaching this stuff to. And he's like, you know, I wasn't sure how much I should share with you and some of the people that seem to be gravitating towards me. So I asked my spirit helper, you know, to show me a sign on who was worthy of this information. And, you know, my spirit animal, my spirit helper is the red-tailed hawk, and he left you a feather, you know. So this could be, you know, some huckster spinning me a yarn, but in reality, like I truly believe like what Amos was telling me. And it was just so weird how that red-tailed hawk feather materialized like literally 3 feet away from me. And those kind of syncs, yeah, the whiteout. And I've had other sort of hallucinatory experiences where I like blacked out or whited out, but I've never fully had like a breakthrough kind of. And I think we talked about this when you're on my show. I've never quite had that like breakthrough beyond, but yeah, beyond the, you know, those kind of experiences, I have had some very odd experiences in the real, you know, that don't sort of, they're not quite high strange enough to be like, you know, worth writing a book about, but they're definitely, you know, synchronicities that I think, like most synchronicities, are ultra personal and extremely meaningful on that personal level.
Oh, yeah, for sure. 100%. And like you were saying, you know, growing up, whenever you started to, you know, experiment with things like marijuana and, you know, for myself, whenever I started smoking weed, it completely changed my perspective on things. You know, I was questioning reality before, but after that, it was like, man, fully fledged questioning everything. And, you know, LSD shifted it even more, you know, as a, you know, growing up in my 20s. And after, you know, I got older and started using it in a more spiritual manner, that's when it really opened up everything. But I think that these substances, these natural substances like weed, like psilocybin, are put here for those very purposes, to get people to access different parts of their brain and different spiritual aspects that they may not have, that may be closed off to before. What do you think about that?
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's why I describe it like the slate was wiped clean, because, you know, there were points in my life where I wanted to join the army. You know, there were points in my life where I wanted to like get Osama bin Laden, you know? So like it was such a like a stark contrast to then go from that mindset to like kind of Bruce Lee hippie mindset, you know, like, because I still like martial arts. I've always been into that combat fight sport type thing. But what I realized was like, oh, this isn't meant to beat people up. This is meant to build people up, you know? Yeah. And that's where like the Tao of Jeet Kune Do and Bruce Lee's sort of like philosophy came into my life. And I found like that just fit so perfectly with everything I was learning in the spiritual, metaphysical realm. But on the point of cannabis and plant teachers, like I was so against drugs and pot, because I had seen people in my family, you know, use alcohol and use certain things that I just were like, you know, that's not healthy, you know, and especially from a young age, you get really scared of that kind of stuff. So when I saw Eddie Bravo taking a bong hit on YouTube and then doing like jujitsu rolls and like actually inventing new jujitsu moves, I was like, huh, that's something. And then I read that Bruce Lee was like eating pounds of hash before he was training. Well, maybe not pounds, but you know, he was eating a significant amount of marijuana. So that was the big like, oh wow, okay, this is actually a beneficial thing. And then of course experiencing that only, you know, confirmed that in a huge way. But what I subtly realized was there was something going on with me that wasn't happening with my peers, because as popular as pot smoking was, I was still as much of a black sheep as I always had been, because cannabis had only made like those odd interests kind of come out, right? And unfortunately, it didn't, and I don't want to say like, oh, I'm enlightened, but it didn't have that same enlightening effect on my peers. So I always got really curious about that. Like, well, why is smoking pot like making me want to read, but it's making my friends want to eat Cheetos and listen to like Nas,
exactly.
like, like they're like, it had like a wasting effect on them. Whereas for me, it was kind of like building me into this new higher self. I was looking for my higher self. And
dude, I am ready for the work day after I smoke it. I'm like totally ready to go, as creative as can be, and I get shit done.
Right. And that's actually was a big problem for me, because I'd always been kind of a lazy kid and had a messy room and all that. So pot really did kind of bring some like motivation into my life that I didn't think it would. And that's like completely opposite of what they tell you too, is like, oh, it's going to ruin your life. You're going to melt into your couch and all that BS. But what really happened was I was getting in touch with the spirit of the plant. And I'm not sure if you've spoken to this guy, but I mean, you've done so many podcasts. I bet you have. Chris Bennett. Are you familiar with Chris Bennett's work? And
this sounds familiar, but I have not had him on.
So you should. He's awesome, really cool guy. He wrote a book called Liber 420, and it basically...
yeah.
Okay.
I know what you're talking about.
Awesome. So he details the history of the occult uses of cannabis, and to me, I think that's what was happening. Like, there was a sort of energy to the plant that I was getting in touch with, whether that's because it's a conscious entity or because it's like an egregore, and all of these similar people who have used it have attached these ideas to the egregore. Whatever it was, like, that came through for me and unfortunately not other people. And then I found tobacco, because at first I was just like, we would smoke blunts, but they were like flavored with, cherry and apple and all this other BS. And so I liked bongs and stuff, but the bong was like an overload. Like a bong, I eventually really despised the bong, and now I only smoke out of a blunt, because I found this sort of natural alternative tobacco wrapper. And at first it was just kind of like a cultural thing. I didn't really see it as a spiritually significant thing. But then Amos kind of reminded me, like, no, tobacco is sacred. And then I just spoke to Gordon White, who reminded me yet again that it's called mapacho in the Amazon, the tobacco spirit. And, we're talking about wild tobacco, which is probably...
Yeah, it's not until you add these additives and nasty fucking chemicals that it's really bad for you,
Right. And it's almost like, think about the spirit, the plant spirit itself as an actual entity that needs to be respected, and then ask yourself, like, oh, is this Marlboro Red like a respectful way to, treat this, right? So that's kind of the thing that Gordon was saying with tobacco. But I find that kind of interesting, because the backwoods that I smoke, they're not processed. They're just like a leaf. So maybe they're sprayed with something and I'll have to deal with that 30 years from now. But, for the time being, I've been smoking these really kind of odd blunts, and everybody seems to either like them or hate them. Like, they're very polarizing. And when I would go to parties and whatnot, people would be like, ew, what's that? Or they would be like, oh man, you smoke these too? So it was a very like odd thing that I was noticing. And what I've come to think is, like, tobacco and cannabis together balance each other. Feminine in cannabis and the masculine in tobacco balanced each other. And for me, that created this kind of like state of awareness, this heightened state of awareness that didn't go too far into the realm of like the bong, which I kind of disliked, because I would get so, head eat out that I couldn't really focus on anything. It kind of added like a focus. And you see that with people who smoke cigarettes, they kind of end up smoking them to stay focused. Like, it seems like they can't focus without them, and it becomes a big problem for them. So, yeah, there's something to that on the plant spirit world. But again, you know, I've done mushrooms, but I haven't done like those hero doses, you know, so I'm still a little bit of like getting my feet wet, you know, I'm in the kiddie shallow end of the pool when it comes to psychedelics.
It's like a roller coaster sometimes. You gotta prep for that shit sometimes.
I don't doubt it. I don't doubt it. But yeah, I'm excited to like live the next however many years with cannabis and tobacco, but I know it's like a limited hangout. Like there's going to come a point, and I'm only 27, so there's come a point, probably in my 30s or 40s, where I'm like, okay, we could put this to the side for now and really start to sort through everything that I've kind of processed over the past however many decades it'll be then.
Right on, for sure, man. And you're talking about, you know, your levels of awareness as you go, and that there are some people that you were saying, you know, from you, marijuana really gave you motivation and opened your eyes. For some, it just made them want to sit on the couch and eat cheesy poofs all day. I think there's a big difference in the, I guess, spiritual nature of people as a whole when you look at it, especially now with the division going on. There's people that seems like they just a husk of a person, like they have no spirituality, no desire, like there's no spark inside of them at all. Right. You can look in their eyes and there's just, you know, deadness. I'm wondering if there are people that are unable, that from birth, from their time in the incarnation on this planet, unable to access that divine spark, unable to get to that state where they desire spirituality, like a non-player character or something, just somebody that doesn't have that soul. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I debate that a lot, and you know, it's a big reason why my family thinks I'm crazy, that I kind of have this spiritual approach and they don't. And that's not to say that they're not like religious, because they do kind of go to church, but they have a very like secular approach to their religion. So I don't know if that has anything to do with it. Maybe it's hospitals and the birth process that does something to it, but to us as human beings. But I will say, you know, to the point of me being kind of like a strange kid and whatnot, what was strange about me was I loved being outside and being in the woods and just kind of like pretending I was an animal, like weird shit like that. Like I didn't like playing like G.I. Joes or like, you know, whatever was on, you know. So I think connecting with nature, it does something energetically to us that without might lead to that state of what we can describe as an NPC. But I don't know if it's ever like permanent. You know, I don't think anybody's like born an NPC and only an NPC. I think it's a choice. And unfortunately, others in this universe that we're in make choices that have sort of an effect on other people to where that they can't make a choice anymore. Because if you're born in let's say a really impoverished area and there's a 5G tower right over your house, like, you know, how are you going to do? What are you going to do? Like, you either have to leave that area, which might be even more risky than staying, or you're just going to be subject to that 5G tower, you know? So, and that's like a weird example of it. But on the point of like hospitals, you see that happen in like the late 19th century, early 20th century, this like push to modernize the birth process. And I wonder if that has something to do with this materialistic mindset that seems to have also come into play in that same time period. You know, it seems like we're constantly replacing the natural mechanizations of life with artificial ones. And that can only lead to a sort of artificial seeming mindset for those in that artificial created reality. I think, you know, it's just part and parcel to being in a sort of mechanicalized world.
Well, while we're talking about this kind of nature of reality, what do we live in discussion? What do you think do you think that this is some kind of, I really don't like the term simulated reality anymore, because I don't think that really covers the depth of what we're in, but that's what I lean towards. I don't think that anything around here is really physical. I think that everything is malleable. I think at a molecular level, nothing is physical. level, and we are in some type of, the only way to put it is simulated reality where, everything is run off of some kind of grand program. That's just my opinion. What do you think about it?
Yeah. Well, it's clear that there is this level of plasticity that would lead us to believe that energy is primary rather than matter being primary. Matter is secondary. And like you put, we see that where, these things that we're told, you can knock on them and they're solid, are actually just as hollow as everything else, because there's this sort of energy field that makes up what we would call physical matter. So yeah, I'm right there with you. I think it's a matter of perspective, and I think the only perspective you can have comes from your mind in that kind of like solipsistic way. Not to say that you are all that exists, but you are sort of like one piece of the whole, and without your piece in the whole has less energy, right? So as this whole WHOLE grows,
Yeah.
Each person or piece of that collective, vibrates at a higher frequency and contributes to the expansion, or vibrates at a lower frequency and contributes to the reduction. And I think we're dealing with a universal expansion in a multi-dimensional sense. So there is no possibility for finitude, because that's just the way things are. It's infinite, it has to be infinite, because we're in that kind of process of expansion or reduction at all times. There is movement and direction. So where that connects to modern life, I think, is with like memory lapses and those kind of synchronicity moments where like you can almost kind of like leave the reality you're in, seemingly, if you have the right memories lapsed or forgotten. You're literally in another reality. I mean, there are people who have head injuries, like tremendous head injuries, where they wake up and all of a sudden they're able to play the piano like a savant, and they've never even played the piano before that head injury. So to me, I think that indicates that your brain is not the source of this information. It's sort of like a piece of the puzzle. It's like the transistor that's bringing the information through, so that when, like in that case of the guy who became a savant pianist after, diving into the shallow end of a pool, his brain didn't get like damaged and now like the piano stuff that was always there like came out. No, I think what happens is his brain was damaged, and that opened up some sort of gate so that information that had been like blocked previously by the indoctrination programming of that person's life was now able to flow through because of that injury. Because you would imagine if our brains were truly like machines, if they get damaged or injured, they'll function to less of a capacity. But this is a case where, and this is not just the only case, I mean, there's plenty of cases like this where his brain was injured and now he has an even greater capacity of skill, ability, and knowledge. To me, that indicates that the brain is simply just like funneling something in. It's not actually holding the information.
For sure, man. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Now, as far as some of the stuff we're seeing going on our world right now, I don't want to get too deep into the whole COVID thing and get kicked off of YouTube. I'd like this one to go. Yeah, right. But as far as, what's really kind of behind everything, when you look beyond the surface layers, is it your belief that we are really just being manipulated on a grand scale as a mass psychological operation to push society in a certain direction, and possibly even cull the population a bit so that those at the top can have more control and power over everything, just the same as they always do in history? Do you think that may be what's going on right now?
Absolutely. And especially when you consider what was going on in 2019 with the Yellow Jacket protests and people protesting to get Britain out of the EU and all these other things that were crumbling away at the New World Order's maybe like plan A. Now they're like, okay, plan B time. And, you know, it's funny. I was just talking to a comedian, Luke Mitchell, who I guess his spouse is a scientist or something or other. And he said that, you know, she lost her job, but one of the things, because of the COVID whole thing, and now I'm kind of losing track of that excellent point that I just had. Son of a bitch. Hold on. I'll get it. I'll pull it out. So he was saying something, but you know, my other point that I wanted to make, I'll save it by going here, is David Whitehead and his Cult of the Medic series that he's doing. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that yet, but I definitely recommend people check it out. I think what he's showing, and I've seen this type of research in other places, Joseph Farrell talks about this a little bit, there is no like, you know, distinction between these like doctors and like a doctor in law or doctor, you know, like doctors are not merely medical officials. Like the term doctor, to me, I think it goes back to the Royal Society and like that sort of, maybe not particularly the Royal Society, but that sort of vein of like, well, we're the academic establishment. But what you find is the academic establishment, they're not there because they're the brightest and the most brilliant. They're there because they're the darkest and the dirtiest, and they've been in control for however many 100 years since they set that up. So I think it was always the goal of the medical establishment to push us towards this sort of inevitable pandemic state. You look at like the eugenicist movements and their connections to what's going on now. But yeah, no, sorry I lost that point there. It was going to make some sense.
I mean, well, how deep do you think I guess you could call it occult aspects or their belief system, do you think that they go into? Because this is where a lot of people check out. This is where a lot of people start to look into this stuff and they say, oh yeah, sacrificing babies, adrenochrome, you know, occult rituals, sucking devil dick. No, I'm checking out. I'm not going to look into this stuff. I don't believe it. But these people who are practicing it and are doing it, there is obvious proof and paper trails that they're involved in these rituals, and you can look at many different historical accounts and aspects and things that are happening now and caught on film everywhere. You know, these people, that are involved in these elite circles have this certain occult belief system that they go off of. And I believe that it's so important to them. They believe that it can manifest a reality for them, a certain outcome, a global outcome. And I think that they believe it so much, and they have their hearts set on this outcome that they're going to do anything to make it manifest into our reality. Right. What do you think?
Right. I think that's 100% it. I think there's, you know, a lot of reason for people to have that skepticism because it does get extreme. I mean, you put it very well there where, you know, it seems like everybody is pointing the finger at Satan or the devil, and it's all, you know, put to this far out extreme. And I think that only serves the people who are actually practicing these occult rituals for there to be all this fear generated, because then it just leads people to either not take it seriously or take it so seriously that others don't take them seriously, right? So there's this kind of embellishment that goes on that serves them. But the reality is that magic just works. That's just the way the universe is. And I think it's almost like a reverse. Like they came from a time period where all of this was known, you know, alternative history shows us that, you know, we have much greater civilizations in the past than we do in the present, right? We look at like some of the megalithic structures to see that and all the hieroglyphic information. I'm thinking what it comes down to for me is there was a sort of fall from an advanced state, and these occult groups have sort of remnants of that magical, scientific, spiritual technology, and they've sort of put this really morose, morbid sort of overlay on the whole practice so that most people are just turned off and afraid of it. And I think what it is they realize that there is no true death, because we're infinite beings, energetic beings, and we're living in multiple lifetimes. That's why they have all these bloodline practices, and they want to reincarnate in the same family every generation, right? They're trying to push themselves into the future almost with these practices. So I think it's more that like these things just work, and they've just done a really great job of helping the rest of us forget how these things work, and that gives them the ability to practice these occult practices with impunity, and then, like I said, put this overlay of morbidity that turns people off and makes people think like it's all evil and disgusting, which it could be. I mean, I've read about child sacrifice taking place even in like tribes that lived in the town that I lived in 400 or 500 years ago. So this isn't something that is all that particular to just one group. It's kind of like a universal idea to sacrifice, firstborn and stuff like that. I don't know. I'm certainly not endorsing anything like that, but I don't know why they would do that. I think because it's so obfuscated, we don't really understand what their goal is of sacrificing a child. But if you look at things from that like spiritual sort of almost detached perspective, it's like, well, if we're all infinite beings and we're all going to be reincarnated, like, is it really that bad that that child like came into this life for only a little bit of time and then just left? Like, I don't know. It seems like a lot more brutal to spend 80 years like, living a life of suffering than to come in and out of it really quickly. That's kind of like, again, like a detached perspective that I'm not endorsing. I don't personally think that way. I have a lot of sympathy and empathy for other human beings, and I'd hate to see anybody get hurt, especially a child. But I think there is a certain context through which all of these practices need to be understood, and the fact that we're ignorant largely of the context only serves the people practicing these practices, because then all that energy is used with impunity, right? Because if we don't understand how it's going on, we can't copy it, we can't replicate it, we can only add energy to it through fear.
For sure. Yeah. And the term, their symbolism will be their downfall. I think that's true to a certain extent, especially right now with everything appearing to be falling apart for them. I notice, it gets disappointing at times when I go out and I see everybody still masked up and a lot of people living in fear, but I do think that the normies are waking up. A lot more people are coming around to what's going on, and it gives me hope that we may be able to turn the course of this timeline around. We might be able to have a different outcome than what's desired from these, elite scumbags. And I think that if they keep making these mistakes, the more they do that, the more people are going to wake up to it. Do you see that they're fucking up, they're making mistakes, they're moving too fast, maybe putting too much symbolism out there? What do you think?
Well, I think there is something to be said about the symbolism and why they put it out there that way, but whether or not like their plan is working, I don't think it's working at all. I think that's why they even had to throw this injection thing into the mix in the first place, because, the metaverse and all the technology that they're trying to scare us with, like, it's so far and away. Like, I personally don't think that they're really close to getting us in the Matrix. So, if they have to, unfortunately, inject us with this thing that who knows what it'll do, I think that's just a sign of their desperation, man. I think if they really had a grip on us as a population, they wouldn't have to mandate it, they wouldn't have to force it. We would all just line up and get it, like it happened in some countries where maybe people are a little more obedient. But here in America, we do have this kind of sense of like personal liberty that maybe they don't have ingrained in them in every country, and you can't say that about every city, but I will say I was surprised, when I saw the towns that I did just kind of go straight for the narrative, and maybe not so surprised in the cases of like New Haven, but there are a lot of towns in this democratic state that I live in who have, made it very clear that they don't support the masks, they don't support the mandates, and there are all these signs in certain neighborhoods that say, unmask your kids, and here's the Governor Lamont's phone number, and call him up and tell him why we need to unmask the kids. So, yeah, I definitely think that because of the media's suppression of information, it seems like it's all one way. But even in a state like Connecticut, which is, you know, second highest income in the whole country and extremely like democratic or liberal, there's plenty of people who are way against it. So yeah, I think the majority of people are just trying to go on with their life, and sadly for some of them that means just getting it to get it over with. But that's not what's going to happen. You know, you're going to get it, and then you're going to be, you know, compromised immune system for however many years and more indebted to this new medical tyranny or form of medical tyranny, because, you know, they couldn't get us on that whole insurance thing that Obama wanted to push through, right? That was a big contentious point with the 2016 election. What's going to happen with health insurance and Medicare and all that shit? Well, to me, from my like really novice perspective on all of that, as someone who just turned 27, I'm only now even, you know, outside of my parents' insurance. It seems to me like that's what the, you know, boosters are all about. You know, you just get someone into a compromised immune system, and it's only going to make them sicker and sicker and sicker. So the people who aren't quite there yet are going to catch on to that really fast. And yeah, I think that's going to wake a lot of people up. Unfortunately, it's going to come with, you know, some lives lost, sadly. You know, I even heard people in my own family talking about the boosters. So I'm like, oh, shit, you know, like, should I say my goodbyes? That sounds awful. But, you know, in reality, like, I think that's what's going to wake people up is it's just going to become way too fishy. And yeah, I have a hope. I have hope for that. But is that part of it? Did they see that? Is that part of the plan, to cull out those who were obedient enough to just go with it, or those who were already hypochondriac enough to fear it? You know, maybe. But yeah, that's what Luke was telling me about that I forgot. Is he was telling me about this doctor that Jesse Ventura interviewed, who moved to Panama, who was like very high up in the, you know, FDA or somewhere, maybe even the WHO, and another prominent doctor said to them outside of a meeting, the culling is happening soon. And this was in 2009. And this made this doctor, you know, fear something enough to move out of the United States and go to Panama. And then Jesse Ventura interviewed her. Now that interview is totally off at the air, because I think that was aired on Jesse Ventura's television program. And sadly, look at what Jesse Ventura has been putting out lately. I mean, geez, have you ever seen like a bigger, like, oh my gosh, that was just like head in the sand, show everybody my rear, I'm an asshole, you know, like Jesse Ventura really disappointed me with that one. But he's an old guy. You can't blame him. He's probably afraid of getting sick himself.
Yeah, I know you're right, but we're definitely living in very interesting times. I think last year was a good year in that they made a lot of mistakes, and it woke a lot of people up. And like I said, I hope this trend continues to where people keep waking up. That's the only hope we have, is to just not participate in the bullshit, in my view. But for the last few minutes I have, let's talk about this. Since you started doing the podcast and booking for Tinfoil Hat, and, you know, talking with these amazing guests and all these, you know, having access to all these amazing topics, what are some of your favorite topics since you started doing this, the ones that really stand out for you?
Well, thank you for saying that, man. I appreciate it. And yeah, I enjoy that. It's so surreal to go from being like a huge listener fan to like actually being able to, like you said, have access to talk to people like yourself who have been doing this for a really long time. I appreciate you coming on my show and having me here. But, you know, what really stands out were the authors that I've gotten to interview so far, you know, because it's one thing for me to be a big podcast listener and have that experience, but I've always been a fan of these books. And for the longest time, you know, when I was a kid, I didn't really ever think that, you know, these people existed outside of my head. You know, when I read their words, it's kind of like a really intimate thing. You know, you read their words in your own voice. So now that I've started to talk to authors I'm starting to like narrate their books with their own voice, like from my memory, and it's like adding like a whole nother layer to it. So without going into a whole nother series of anecdotes, Peter Shampoo was one of my favorite authors because, you know, I don't think he had many interviews up until that point. So there weren't a lot of like other shows I could go and research him on. So I was like kind of forced to read his book, which is a good practice for me, because that's what I've resolved to, you know, be my resolution for 2022, do more author interviews and read their book in full first. So yeah, Peter Shampoo was great. And that was also a special one because it connected with the area I've grown up in, which, you know, New England is strange, but it doesn't get much like press outside of New England for being strange. Like I know a lot of people are familiar with the vortexes in Arizona, and people are familiar with like, you know, the strange stuff in Mount Shasta and like even Bermuda Triangle stuff. But I don't know, you know, for someone like yourself who didn't grow up anywhere near New England, had you ever heard of anything other than maybe like the witches type stuff about New England?
Yeah, not much.
So It was awesome to find out like there's all this sacred, spiritual Native American history here, you know, and I kind of visited a few of these sites not even knowing what I was looking at when I was younger. And then to read in Peter Shampoo's book that like, oh yeah, that place where I had an acid trip was also on this amazing ley line that's been, you know, that was just so cool because it connected so many dots. And really what's also interesting about that is I only found out about Peter Shampoo's work because I went to, well, it's a whole long story that I got into on Your Handbook for the Apocalypse. But either way, it's the synchronicity, you know, that's what's important. That's what is so ultra personal. And that's what I like to inspire with the listeners of the show, because I've already seen it happen. You know, people hit me up and say, hey, man, I looked into my own yard and I'm getting into this synchromysticism stuff. And it's really cool to find out, you know, people are resonating and then taking that, you know, intrepidness into their own lives to go out and explore where they're from and find all the connections there. So, you know, I don't know. I don't feel like I answered your question that well, to be honest, but Peter Shampoo would be one of my favorites to go with. And then, you know, it's so cool to talk to people like, you know, Jay Dyer, Isaac Weishaupt, who, you know, I listen to on shows and just kind of like, you get really nervous before you interview them, and then you talk to them, and then it's like, oh, they're just normal, cool guys like you and me. And that's what I found out with this whole community, whether you're on a show, you're a guest, or even just listeners, is like we're building this really cool community that you might not have known was out there if you're just, you know, isolated podcast listener like I was.
Very cool, man. Last question. Is there any topics that you started out having one way of looking at it or belief about it, and then after you learned more, spoke with, you know, certain guests about it, it completely changed your view on it, or maybe turns you into a believer about something that you were completely skeptical of?
Well, yeah, I think DMT has become like one of those like things that people keep telling me I need to try, and slowly but surely I've a little warmed up to it a little more and more. But honestly, the alien thing was a big one for me. You know, I really believed in aliens for the longest time, and now I'm starting to really question it. You know, it's becoming a thing where I'm like, well, they're definitely not from other planets. You know, like it seems like I'm just checking off this list of like, well, they're not this, right. And it seems more and more human phenomena the more I get into it. But that's not, you know, to say that it's any less strange than. Because then it has so much to, like, oh, there's so much to get into. So, yeah, aliens. I mean, I used to think the pyramids were built by aliens. So now to think that they were built by, like, ancient civilizations of humans that were more advanced than we are now, that's, like, really what
Well, do you think that there are other intelligences or other consciousnesses outside of the spectrum of our vision or reality that can communicate or interact with us?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I never doubted that, but I just, for some reason, I guess I doubted our potential as human beings to be equal in that role. Like for a while it was like, oh yeah, but aliens are better than us, so they did all the pyramids and whatnot. But no, now I'm starting to see like we're kind of like on equal ground with them. I guess that's really what I've come to find out.
Yeah, you know, I'm right there with you. I think, you know, a lot of the ancient stuff, why couldn't it be just advanced humans? A lot of the stuff we're seeing in the sky, Probably ours, but I definitely look at the interdimensional side, and I definitely believe that there are intelligences, life forms right outside the spectrum, living right here with us. We just can't see them. You know, even Bigfoot creatures. I'm very open to that type of stuff too.
Yeah.
But that's a whole new show. That's a whole nother show, man. We could get into that too. So I'd love to have you back on in the future to get into that stuff.
Thank you. Yeah. Likewise for my show, and it was a pleasure. Like the first time. So yeah, I'd be happy to come back.
Yeah, that was awesome. Before you head out, let everyone know where they can find My Family is Crazy, social media, anything else you want to plug before you head out.
Well, as crazy as I think my family is, they're pretty normal in comparison to most people. So the show's called My Family Thinks I'm Crazy because I'm the crazy one. And if you feel that way too, listen to the show. It might resonate with you. And we have a bunch of like mini series type shows that I've been doing lately. One of my favorites is Your Handbook for the Apocalypse with Michael Wan, which we do on his Susquehanna Alchemy feed. And that's all a different podcast feed. So check that out as well, Susquehanna Alchemy. But yeah, just type My Family Thinks I'm Crazy in any podcast app and you're sure to find us.
Sweet. Well, thank you so much, Mark. We're going to do this again sometime soon. And until next time, everyone, have an excellent evening. We'll be talking again tomorrow.